I'm Jordan Wirfs-Brock, presenting Entangling the Role of Maker and Interpreter in Interpersonal Data Narratives, Explorations in Yarn and Sound, with Mikhaila Friske and Devendorf of the University of Colorado. The personal data we can collect and store about ourselves, data on our whereabouts, our moods, our media consumption, is proliferating. So too are data things created from this information, often made for us, but can also be made by us. In this context, we're curious how acts of making and acts of making meaning are intertwined. We ask two questions about data things, which can often be perceived as communicating some true narrative. First, where do the boundaries between maker and interpreter lie? And second, who, or even what, has the authority to assign meaning through narrative? In this video, we address how we were motivated by another interpersonal project, Dear Data, our process for creating, exchanging, and interpreting data artifacts, details about the artifacts themselves, themes that emerged through reflecting on these artifacts, and finally, how this project can help us rethink the roles of maker and interpreter in the data narratives that increasingly surround us. We're inspired by Dear Data, a project where two people, Georgia Lupi and Stephanie Posevec, forged a friendship through exchanging hand-drawn postcards with visualizations of personal data. We admire their handcrafted interpersonal approach and adopt it in our project. We extend Dear Data by exploring non-traditional materials for creating data artifacts, yarn, and sound. In Dear Data, the legends for understanding the visualizations are often more interesting than the visualizations themselves. In contrast, we were curious how removing a legend and its references to true meaning might allow alternate stories to emerge from data. Here's our process. First, Mikhaila and I met to decide which topics to collect data on, landing on commuting, forgetting, and busyness. For each topic, we independently spent a week collecting data, however we felt was most appropriate. Then, we each reflected on our data and how we might use it to create an artifact, embedding our narrative intent. Mikhaila used knitting and crocheting to make physical objects out of yarn, and I used sound design and sonification to make audio recordings. Then, we exchanged the artifacts and recorded ourselves interpreting the foreign artifact without guidance from the other person. Finally, we discussed the meaning of the data artifacts together as a pair. This took about 3 to 4 weeks for each topic. Next, I'll present the two artifacts about forgetting, along with the interpretations by the person who did not make it. You can find detailed accounts from the maker's perspective in the paper and supplemental materials. First, the forgetting yarn artifact, a scarf, which Mikhaila created and I interpreted.
There's the color, there's the clustering, there's the actual stitch itself, there's whether it's a wart or a hole. The anomalies are the moments of forgetting. And they're in this matrix. They're in this matrix of sort of status quo of regular life. There's this like diagonal discontinuity. It's like 5 or 6 inches long. It like never quite connects itself. So it's like not a momentary act of forgetting, but it's this like ongoing stream.
And the forgetting sound artifact, presented via a web interface, which I created and Mikhaila interpreted.
So it is a website, different sounds. That one's a very like buzzy. Cuckoos. Okay, I feel like there was a zing before. I'm gonna call that the wah. And they sound vaguely familiar, but they don't sound exactly the same. Okay, so zings are forgetting to write things down. All of these clocks sound different. This is very frustrating, and I feel this frustration is probably supposed to be a part of the sonification.
And now Mikhaila's going to take over to talk about our findings.
So through our process, a few themes emerged. Negotiations between materials, data, and narrative intent, how the data of the experience contrasted with the experience of the data, and the coexistence of multiple narratives. The first theme deals with the effects of our unconventional materials, which had their own agency. The materials did unexpected things that shaped our data narratives. As I crocheted a mug cozy representing my busyness data, I turned it over and saw a mess of tangled yarns on the back. In addition to the intended material narrative of crocheted rows of organized data, the reverse side had an unintended narrative, a jumbled mess that expressed the feeling of busyness. And Jordan, when creating a busyness artifact in the form of an audio drama featuring Amazon's Alexa, wrote a script featuring groans and guttural yells. But when Alexa pronounced these, Jordan had to relinquish control of those sounds to the text-to-speech software, which had a will of its own and made its way into the narrative. Our next theme is how the data of the experience contrasted with the experience of the data. In some cases, data collection served as a counter-argument to overturn our prior perception of a lived experience. For example, when collecting busyness data, Jordan documented the perceived and actual stress of her obligations, and realized how disparate they were. Our experiences of collecting data about forgetting also highlighted how resistant to data collection some experiences are. We both grappled with a paradox of collecting data about forgetting, which can only be done through remembering. I represented data of unnoted forgettances as holes in my scarf, evoking lost data without explicitly fabricating it. Which segues to our final theme, the coexistence of multiple narratives in data artifacts. We invited a multiplicity of narratives by exchanging the objects without any legends or guide, while also actively attempting to make our narratives legible to each other. In some cases, the interpreter found meaning that the maker didn't explicitly embed. I heard the rhythmic undertone of Jordan's commuting compositions as expressing monotony. Although Jordan had intended it solely as a clue about the time scale, this new interpretation nonetheless rang true to her lived experience. The multiplicity of narratives also emerged through the different languages we use to describe the data artifacts. While interpreting my forgetting artifact, Jordan had developed a taxonomy of discontinuities in the knit, holes, and warts. Yet what she called warts, I had called bulbs, and calling something a wart as opposed to a bulb changes the way we think about the experience it represents.
With these findings in mind, let's revisit our key questions. We asked, where do the boundaries between maker and interpreter lie? Throughout this process, we found ourselves vacillating between the roles of maker and interpreter. As makers, we would pause to interpret and change the course of our designs. As interpreters, we would remake the artifacts in our minds and in our words. Thus, the line between maker and interpreter is fuzzy and constantly shifting. Now to our second question, who or what has the authority to assign narrative meaning? We learned not just to accept, but also to embrace the new perspectives brought by other actors, such as time, materials, tools, data, and interpreters. Materials are makers in their own right, with the authority to embed narrative intent. Multiple narratives coexist, and none is more right. So how might the DISC community draw from this work? Our work suggests new ways of self-tracking that de-emphasize data and the individual and foreground a process of collaborative making and interpreting. Imagine a tool that gives you assignments for creating with your data, like performing your sleep data as a song. Perhaps these artifacts are randomly swapped with others, a chat roulette for interpretation. Or, once you've created a data artifact, the data itself might be ceremoniously erased forever, leaving only the artifact and its interpretations behind. Reminding us that we are not deciphering an ultimate meaning, but rather disentangling a multiplicity of narratives from materials. Humans and materials, as makers and interpreters, working collectively to make meaning.